MFA Writers Podcast. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. If you're a returning listener, welcome back. We are so glad to have you. And if you are new to the pod, let me start by letting you know what you can expect. Every 2 weeks, we will release an episode in which I interview a creative writing student from one of the country's 250 plus MFA programs. The purpose of these interviews is twofold: to provide current and prospective MFA students with an inside look at MFA programs, and to spread the word about some of the most exciting emerging writers around the country. One of our listeners, E. Mimzo, said this about the show: "The podcast is a delightful companion to the MFA bug I've had for months. I am constantly inspired by the individuals Jared interviews and even find myself listening to some of the same episodes over again. Each episode is unique to each poet/writer, yet somehow Jared continues to bring everything back to the main focus on MFA programs and what they can do for writers, and what they struggle with as well. I can't wait for more episodes. Thank you." Thank you, E. Mimzo, and to everyone else who's listening. We couldn't do this without your support. You can find MFA Writers on Instagram and Twitter, as well as mfawriters.com. Feel free to shoot us a direct message on one of those platforms or an email at mfawriterspodcast@gmail.com. We love to hear from listeners. And if you have a minute to rate or review the show like E. Mimzo did, the best place to do that is on Apple Podcasts. Doing so will help boost our podcast as we try to boost these amazing writers. Finally, as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the episode. Welcome to MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today I'm with Shreya Fadia. Shreya is a third-year fiction candidate in the MFA program at Indiana University, where she currently serves as editor-in-chief of Indiana Review. Her fiction appears or is forthcoming in Black Warrior Review, Cream City Review, and the Florida Review Online. Before beginning her MFA, she practiced law in New York City. She's originally from Mumbai, India, and today Shreya is going to read the beginning of a short story in progress titled The Haunting of Ada Lynn Fellows.
The Haunting of Ada Lynn Fellows. Mount Merrimack's bereavement support group met every other Thursday night in a stuffy, little-used room in the basement of a former Pentecostal church, down a set of rickety stairs, at the end of a murky hallway. Former because it had been nigh on 40 years since the last parishioners gathered beneath the gabled roof of First Pentecostal Church of Mount Merrimack. In retrospect, the decision to hold meetings in that particular location was poorly considered. But by the time the ghost of Yardley Thompson, the snake handler responsible for the church's closure, made his first appearance in what was usually Susan Blakely's chair, the rec center across town had already been rented out by the local square dance club. They had offered to share the space by hanging a curtain to cut the large room in two, but all involved agreed that it wouldn't do to have any do-si-doing in the middle of group. If Larson Ogden had been from around those parts, he would have heard of the snake-handling incident and known to take his meetings elsewhere, or so the townsfolk observed whenever he limped past, his prosthetic leg squeaking, his cane click-clacking. "If only he had asked, we might have warned him, wouldn't we have done, Mother?" Mrs. Arlene Pleasant was reported to have said one morning to her aged mother, Mrs. Marlene Abbott, on their way to the salon. But one hates to pry. One hates to interfere. "No surer truth has been spoken, daughter dear, though I do wish someone would tell him to do something about that shoe and its infernal racket." "Didn't you hear, Mother?" Mrs. Arlene said, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's the leg. It's not really his. Not really real. Lost it in all that awful business upstate, the poor soul." All things considered, while Yardley's ghostly form twirling his prodigious, pearlescent mustaches was an unsettling sight for those who hadn't yet met him, and his moaning was admittedly a nuisance, especially on stormy days when it was at its loudest. He had as much to grieve as the rest of the group. They could hardly complain. And so it was that Yardley became a permanent fixture of their bi-weekly meetings, always already waiting whenever the first of them began to filter in. Yardley never spoke, and it was widely suspected that he had lost the capacity for speech, his throat having played an essential role in the incident that cost him his life. But he could communicate through the inclination of his head the depth and extent of his fellow feeling, and the others found there was comfort to be had in that sympathetic angle. As time passed, Yardley came to serve as a mascot for them all, a symbol of their grief, a reminder, gently wafting above his metal folding chair, that in death they too might find a new beginning, a second chance at life. Half in jest, they began to call themselves the Ghost Group, a name by which they came to be known more broadly, though not so broadly as Yardley's crew, or the lesser variant, Larson's crew. The first time Ada Lynn Fellows attended Mount Merrimack's bereavement support group, she knew she was in the right place because a sheet of torn notebook paper taped to the closed door told her Ghost Group was in session and that latecomers were welcome to walk right in. Ada Lynn was indeed a latecomer, late because the new mothers group she'd come from had run long. She had driven as fast as she dared on the unfamiliar, winding, lonely stretch of road that separated Mount Merrimack from the town of Point Holly. Next time, if there was a next time, she would have to leave early. The hardest part was always the first meeting. The introductions, the thinly veiled attempts at piecing together her past, her damage, the unspoken quid pro quo. I'll show you mine, you show me yours. But there was no sense in delaying. So quietly as she could, Ada Lynn pulled the door open and walked in. A current of murmuring voices surged to greet her, and coursing beneath it a low, tremulous moan. The room's fluorescence was harsh, almost discordant after the subterranean gloom of the hall, and Ada Lynn, momentarily blinded, stopped short just past the doorway, frozen there as if with fright. The flurry of voices stilled, and Ada Lynn sensed, though she could not immediately see to know it, that all eyes in the room were trained on her. "Welcome, friend," a voice she would later come to recognize as Larson Ogden's said from the seat nearest the door. "Yes, welcome," 10 more voices chorused from every corner. "Thank you," Ada Lynn said, drawing herself up taller. She blinked at the dozen faces that stared back at her with polite interest. "I'm Rachel Quinn." A beat, a swallow. "The widow of my late husband, William Quinn, and I am so pleased to make your acquaintance."
Shreya, thanks so much for reading that, and thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I really enjoyed reading this excerpt and listening to you read it. I can't wait to read the rest of the story. But one thing that stood out to me was the use of these supernatural elements in what is clearly a literary piece of fiction. So do your stories usually include some type of genre element?
I wouldn't say usually. It kind of depends on sort of like what mood I'm in, like, what the season is or something like that. Like a lot of the pieces that I wrote like over the past year, I think have had like speculative elements of some sort. But I actually I've been working on like a draft of my thesis. And I've been trying to put like speculative elements in there, but for some reason it's just not working. It's just not happening.
So with this story, when you first got the idea for it, was the ghost in there? Was that part of the original idea, or was that something that came from somewhere else later?
So this is kind of funny because I was thinking about this story, and when I like first started writing it, I think like earlier in February or March of this year, it did have a ghost in it, and I don't know. I was just kind of imagining, like, what if there were a town that were like inhabited by ghosts, like ghosts that just were coming for some reason and were drawn to this area, and like what would happen? Like what would daily life be like for the ghosts? And that part of the story isn't really part of this excerpt, but that's where it starts going after this section. But then, like, as I was just thinking about this like the other day, and I realized like actually this story probably started out as an entirely literary story. Back when I was applying to MFA programs, I had written like something that was about a woman who like goes to group therapy. And like it's changed like considerably. Like it doesn't have any of the same characters, or like the ghost thing is entirely new and it's taken on a new kind of dimension. But I wonder if like it really started there and like now, 2 or 3 years later, it's expanded or something like that.
Well, It's really unique and it's really interesting, I think. I love the idea of a ghost not really haunting anyone, like not wandering around the attic, but just sitting in group therapy with these people. Like, what would that look like? I love that idea. So what do you think the benefits are to incorporating these type of elements into a piece? Like, are there ways in which incorporating genre elements can elevate a piece of fiction, in your opinion?
I definitely think so. I guess I can talk about like what I think of the benefits are for me personally. And I think it's just that, well, let me back up a little bit. So I read this craft book by Benjamin Percy called Thrill Me. And in like the first section of it, he talks, like in the introduction of it, he talks about like when he was a kid and the sorts of things that he would like to read. And he liked Stephen King and like all these like genre writers. And that was like what really brought him to the world of reading and to literature and to writing eventually. And I don't know. I think that's true for a lot of people. Like, you know, when you're a kid, you like, at least when I was a kid, like I was reading like things like Goosebumps and Redwall. And like, these were the things that I was really into. And that really brought me into this. And like, as I got older, like I started reading like literary things, but I guess it's a long-winded way of saying that in some ways it's a return to childhood and return to like that initial kind of joy and the sort of pleasures that I found in the world of reading. And I think maybe that comes through in some ways. I don't know, like it comes through in the writing process, at least for me.
I think so. I mean, what better way to explore trauma than with a spirit who has like unfinished business in this world, right? I mean, who has more trauma than this ghost probably. So it's an interesting angle. And I love that idea of returning to these things that we loved when we were kids. I read every single Goosebumps book, some of them twice.
Wow.
Right? So, you know, I loved those books. But you do reach a point when you're trying to do this for a living, you're trying to make a career out of writing, where there's this feeling like those types of elements aren't literary, that they don't belong in literary fiction. And until not that long ago, it really felt like having those elements in your piece meant you weren't going to get it published in a literary journal. It seems to be changing now. But do you think there are still risks to including those types of elements in a piece like this?
Yeah, I think there are. And I agree that like maybe things have been changing. I mean, you have writers like Kelly Link and Karen Russell and George Saunders and Carmen Maria Machado and just, you know, a whole list of people who have been including these sorts of elements in their work and getting a lot of attention and a lot of acclaim, right? Like didn't George Saunders win like the Booker Prize or something like that for Lincoln in the Bardo?
Which is full of ghosts. The whole thing is ghosts, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that there are definitely risks. These are things that are changing, like as our cultural tastes and what we look for and expect from our writing is changing. But there are still magazines out there, like when you read like submission guidelines that they say that they're not like into genre. But I also am seeing as well, like people in those sorts of submission guidelines, like they're open to elements from genre things. And that's of course not even getting into like all of the journals like Fantasy or Nightmare Magazine or Lightspeed that are explicitly just focused on publishing genre and are doing some really great things.
So was there a period in your writing life where you really tried not to include these types of things in your writing?
I don't know that it was like a conscious decision, but I think that maybe even in just the little bit of time, like when I was applying for MFA programs and all of that, where I was trying to read like more literary work, like more traditionally literary things. And also, I don't know, I just find that like what I'm reading tends to have some impact on like what I'm writing. So I do wonder if like that was kind of like going on in the background and if there was this sort of unconscious pressure that I was putting on myself to write things that were serious literary stories.
So at what point did you give yourself the permission to start doing these cool, fun genre elements that you loved when you were a kid? Like what motivated that change, you think?
Part of it, I think, is just having come to this program. And so there was a visiting professor in my first year, Michelle Pretorius, who has a lot of like mystery elements and like is really into the genre of mystery and brings that into her work. So we read things that were like literary and that also had these sorts of things in it. And then I also took a genre class here that she taught. And I was thinking about just like, why was I really limiting myself to this? Like, they were reading some great writers who write speculative fiction and who are doing those sorts of things in their work. And I didn't really like have a good reason to not try it. So I think some of it was that. Some of it was just, again, like I was saying, like what I read does have some impact on what I end up incorporating in my writing. And I think just in my like free time when I was reading, I was like going back to some of the like fantasy things or just kind of for reading for pleasure, like the sort of graduate school kind of books that I have on my bookshelf. And I wonder if that was also kind of informing some of what I was writing.
I wonder too if it's a confidence thing. If we have to somehow, or we feel like we have to somehow prove to ourselves that we can write a straight literary fiction story before we can give ourselves permission to go in different directions.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I hadn't really like been around other writers and I wasn't really very sure of myself. I mean, I still am not very sure of myself as a writer. So I don't know if that's really gone away, but there's something about like just being around other people who are doing similar things. And maybe it made it easier to kind of give myself some permission to like explore some of those things.
Right. Well, and you haven't always been around writers in your life, right? What
Right.
was your early reading and writing life like?
So I have always been an avid reader. Some of my earliest memories of the United States, like after my family immigrated here, were of going to the library and going to the school library and just like having stacks of books. And I mentioned like some of the things that I would read when I was younger, like Redwall, and Goosebumps and things like that. So, I would always just be reading, at the same time, like my parents, in kind of a cliche, stereotypy, like immigrant parent way, would kind of say, like, stop reading fiction, like go read something, educational, whatever that means. And so, there's always that kind of tension. And I wonder if some of the fact that they were trying to get me to stop reading was actually like pushing me toward it in a way. And then in terms of like writing, I think I wrote my first like it was a very, very short story. It was about like the Easter Bunny getting lost in like the Bermuda Triangle or something. It was for class in like third grade or something like that. And, I'd kind of write on and off. And then I went through like a bad poetry phase in high school, which is to say that I wrote bad poetry, not that, like it was bad to have gone through it. Just, It was terrible poetry. I'm not very good at that. And then in college, I would kind of write like on my own, but I would say that the first time that I got more serious about writing was probably after law school. I was clerking for a year for a judge. And, when you're working for the federal government, you have a slightly more like 9 to 5 kind of schedule. And I had kind of had this dream of being a writer. And I thought like, well, I'm not actually doing it. So it's just going to be this thing that I'm never going to do unless I start like actually putting some time into it and some work into it. So I started like waking up early before work and just, would set a goal to write, X number of words or for X amount of time. And then I started working on a novel that was also terrible that will like not see the light of day. It's like buried somewhere in the back of a drawer or metaphorical drawer, I guess, because it's on my computer still. But yeah, and I just really loved it. And it wasn't something I was really sharing with anyone, but I just kept doing it.
Well, before we go any further, I have to say, I think you should return to the Bunny in the Bermuda Triangle story and maybe give it a revision. I'd love to read it.
Yeah, I'll have to. I wonder where it is.
I think my first story I ever wrote was in first grade, and it was like Teacher from the Black Lagoon fan fiction or something. I don't know.
That sounds amazing.
Oh, man. So you mentioned that you are an immigrant from India, and you told me before the interview that despite the stereotype of Indian doctors, your parents were working class.
Right.
So do you mind telling us a bit about growing up in that environment and how you think that kind of upbringing has affected your writing today.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that my parents, like I grew up in a sort of working class kind of family. Like my mom worked as an assembly worker at a factory until like very recently when she retired. And my dad, when we first moved here and for a few years after we had moved to the US, like was working several jobs, like convenience store and just doing lots of things and juggling that. And I think that affected my writing in ways that I don't know that it is like a direct thing. Like maybe it comes through in terms of like what sort of characters and what lives I'm interested in exploring and the kind of things that I want to explore in my work. I think about just like what sorts of things were out there that I was reading, like when I was a teenager and the sort of representations of Indian characters. And, a lot of it was like caricature of, on The Simpsons, you'd have like someone working at a convenience store and it's a very like caricatured sort of character. And then, there were also like Indian doctors or professionals. And in some books that I really loved, like I love Jhumpa Lahiri's The Namesake, but it is also a very specific, like aspect of like Indian life. And, it's a specific group of people. And what I wasn't seeing was like children and like adolescents who had grown up in similar kind of environments. And, maybe that's what I'm doing unconsciously, like trying to fill that kind of void of like the sort of things that I had wished that I could have had access to or seen without even really being aware of it, if that makes sense. Like, I don't know that when I was, 12 years old or 14 or 15 or whatever, that I had enough like self-awareness to understand like this is what I was missing. But it's like now that I'm going back and thinking about it, like maybe these are things that are coming through in my work.
Well, and you told me too that it wasn't until you were in college that you realized other people had more money than your family had growing up. And that's a really interesting realization. I wonder how that's affected your worldview or your lens.
I think it's just maybe something that I didn't really think that much about. And I wonder if that's like relatively common. Like once you go out of like the environment, like and go out of your normal and whatever the status quo is and are around a different kind of set of conditions or something, that you can really have the space and the distance to understand some things that you can't when you're in the midst of it. And maybe I just became kind of hyper aware of some of the differences. And maybe that kind of hyper awareness has kind of continued as I have lived in Manhattan and like worked in Manhattan. And like, it's a different kind of world.
Right. Well, you and I come from very different backgrounds in many ways, but in other ways, I think we're very similar. I'm also from a working class family and community in which education was for getting a career. So it's not surprising to me that you became a lawyer. But I'd love to hear what drew you to that profession and how long were you doing it?
So I think I was drawn to that profession, for the reasons like stability, practicality. It is a more like practical kind of job than like sitting around and like writing like fiction that, yeah. I don't know if anyone will ever read it. But I think I was a litigator. So like litigators now, like you just do a lot of writing, especially when you're working in like a law firm setting. So I've always been a writer in some way. Even if I wasn't writing like creatively, I was an English major and I studied history in college. So I've always been interested in analytical writing. And that was something that I think drew me to the law. And I really enjoyed that aspect of it. Like I like doing research. I like getting kind of into the weeds of the case law and all of that. So I think that's the other side of like what took me to the law. I ended up not staying for very long. Like I, went to law school, clerked and then worked for a couple of years, after that. And then, after I had been working, when I'd been clerking and I had been writing in the mornings, like that was something that I had very much hoped to continue doing when I went to work at the law firm. But there really isn't enough time in the day, to do that. And I found that I just didn't have the energy to go to work and do all of the things that were expected of me. Even if I was enjoying it, it's still like it requires a type of energy and attention that left me too tired, like emotionally, and like just, like when I'd go home at like 9 o'clock or something to then sit down and try to write more at my computer. So I thought, I'm pretty young still. Like I'm only going to have a little bit of time to, try this out. I thought like, why don't I do it? Like, why don't I apply to MFA programs and try out this writing thing and see where it takes me?
I love the idea of you just like trying to find little moments to sneak in creative writing while you're also a lawyer, which I imagine takes up a lot of time. Did you know anyone else in the law world who was doing things like this? That also had a creative itch like this?
It's kind of funny because like, no, I didn't at the time, but then I graduated and then I realized like, actually there's someone in my graduating class who, I mean, just today I saw that he got nominated for a World Fantasy Award. Like it's amazing, wow. But he was in my class and I didn't really know him, Toshi Onyebuchi. And he's, I don't know, like I wish I had known that. I wish I had like talked to him about things like that. And there have been a couple of people who graduated from my law school who've gone on to write. And I think it's pretty common, like for lawyers to write. And I don't know, maybe I think some people have much more of like the willpower and the energy, I guess, to be able to balance working full time in law and finding times to write. And I just didn't.
I love the idea of like, it's like a dirty little secret or underground community within the law world, and the doctors and business people, they're all, like actually fiction writers in their spare time. I'm just going to pretend that's the way it actually is. So did you have any like formal creative writing training at that point before you applied to MFA programs?
I did not. I had taken in high school, I took like a semester or maybe it was even half a semester. I don't even remember, but there was like a creative writing class that I took then. And I think we spent a lot of it like watching movies, and I like wrote a screenplay for it or something like that. But that was the most training I had. Like I hadn't taken workshops or anything like that. I'd just been kind of doing it on my own.
So was it intimidating to apply to an MFA program without really much workshop experience?
I was thinking about this earlier, and I think that it wasn't until I actually got to the MFA program that I finally processed, like, wait, what did I do? Like I quit my job and applied to MFA programs, and I hadn't done this before. I think it just maybe, like getting caught up in the plan to do it and to apply. I didn't give myself enough time to really think about it, which is like really hard to believe, like, because I'm a very like risk averse person and like to plan things out, but somehow like the reality of, what I was doing in some ways, and the fact that I hadn't had, I don't know, it just seems like a really bold thing to do, and one that I am shocked that something that I'm shocked that I did in retrospect. But yeah, I mean, it was terrifying when I got to the MFA program and, had to go and figure out like how to write a response letter, like to someone for a workshop piece. It turned out that there was a little bit of a learning curve for me personally, and just like figuring out some of the language and figuring out like how to teach creative writing to other people once, like not having done that. But it's worked out well.
Well, maybe the key to making really bold accomplishments is to not know that it's a bold thing in the moment when you're doing it, because you did it. You got into a really great program, the MFA program in Indiana. It's a 3-year fully funded program. They have tracks in poetry and fiction. It's a fairly small program. They accept 4 students in each genre each year, but you got in. What was it like to be in that first workshop?
It was just completely new to me. I mean, I tried to read before I started, like during the summer. I tried to just like read, like, what is the workshop experience like? And just did a lot of Googling, and tried to like find advice for like how to write a workshop letter and like what to expect and all of that. But like I was scared. I was just nervous to be there and to be around people who had much more experience in that kind of environment. But it was, I don't know, like kind of unfounded. Like once I got there, and like everyone was really welcoming, and it didn't matter. We were all there and we were all like treating the work like on its own terms. And yeah, like after, the first little bit of like time and like the bit of nervousness that I had at the outset, I kind of got over it and it didn't really matter.
Right. So did Indiana provide any kind of support to students on what to expect in a workshop or how to be a good member of a workshop community before you actually got into that first workshop?
Yeah. So we did talk about it. Every professor kind of does it differently, but for that first workshop that we had, we like created our own like sort of rules, and, supplemented by whatever like things that Michelle wanted us to be mindful of as well. And we talked about it of like how to talk to each other in the actual conversation. She also, I think she also gave us like a list of like just like tips for how to read a story, and how to like approach giving written feedback as well. And then I actually went and talked to, I talked to Michelle, I talked to, Brando, Skyhorse, who's another, who is like on the faculty here. And I told them like, I'm new to this. I'm nervous. I just want to talk to you about it. And I think that was really helpful. And so I felt supported, both like in terms of like what to expect in the procedural way, but then also in that additional like emotional way.
That's great. Yeah, I think that's super important. I think a lot of programs and a lot of professors kind of assume that people are coming into MFA programs with workshop experience and know how it's going to go. I was a little unsure myself coming in too. And I remember thinking, I've talked to some of my peers about this since, how nice it would be to have a class that first semester that's really just about how to be really good at workshop, how to perform well in workshop, how to write those letters, how to talk about someone's piece in a respectful way. I think it could be really useful. But I love that at least the professors in your program were taking the time to talk to you about those things. So how big are the workshops? I know the program is like a fairly small program, but are you workshopping with people from all 3 years?
So you typically only take coursework during the first 2 years. So again, like it will sort of vary depending on, the professor and what their preferences are. But I'd say it's anywhere from like 8 to 12 people in a workshop. So typically it would just be, the 4 people in your cohort, including yourself, and then the people in the second year. So the first and second years take workshop together. And that would just be fiction. And then poetry has the same thing. But there are sometimes like professors who will be open to like having, like there were some poets in workshop with us, the second semester who, there were people who had experience writing and were also like doing, like someone was working on a novel, someone was working on a collection of short stories. So they were welcomed to the workshop, but it kind of depends, but it's not going to be more than like 8 to 12 people.
And you mentioned that you only take coursework the first 2 years. So the third year, are most students not taking any courses? They're just focusing on their thesis?
Again, that depends. I actually will be taking one class because I didn't quite like finish up my coursework. But there are also options here, if you're like getting an MA in something else, like I think you can get an MA in English and like there are just other things that people might be doing. So they might end up needing to take coursework. But generally, the idea is that you spend your first 2 years on coursework and you get that out of the way. And then if you want to or need to for other reasons, then you can. But you focus on writing your thesis the third year.
So how many courses would you typically have to take per semester in those first 2 years in order to not take any classes the third year?
I think it's about 3. And some of it is the timing, 3 a semester, sorry. And some of it is the pedagogy classes that we have to take to support our teaching. They're not the full number of credits. So I think there are ways like where you can fill in some credits. Like if you do the IU Writers Conference, I think there's a way to take that and get a couple of credits, like over the summer. So there are other ways to get some credits and be able to avoid that.
Well, the excerpt you read at the beginning of the episode was from a short story, but you've also dipped your toes into the novel writing world. Have you been workshopping short stories or novel excerpts while you're in the program?
I've kind of done both. And it depends on the professor in terms of like what they're okay with for workshop. I think one of Michelle, when she was a visiting professor, like had said like you can workshop one section of a novel, but the other two had to be short stories. But then like there have been other professors who've had other kind of, expectations or requirements, and they've just been more open. And so it's kind of been all over the place. So I've done mostly short stories, but then last semester I did like a novel thing. I did a short story and then kind of like the first part of a much longer short story.
So what's been your takeaway from having that experience of workshopping both a short story and a novel excerpt in a workshop? How are they different? How are they similar? Is there one that works better in your opinion than the other?
Personally, I wonder if workshopping short stories is a little bit easier in some ways, just because people are more familiar with it. It seems to be the case that it's more common to workshop short stories. That said, like, I think if you want to have a productive workshop of a novel section, it's helpful to provide, the readers with like maybe a little bit of a synopsis of like where you think the novel is going, like some kind of context so that they can understand like where that is fitting into the broader picture. And, there are challenges to having just like being able to see a smaller section of an entire story. But I think with that little bit of context, it can be really helpful.
Okay, so that's the differences between workshopping those two. But what about the differences between writing those two? What's your experience been writing the novel versus writing a short story?
It's been very different. My process for writing short stories tends to be that I revise like as I'm writing. I try not to do that because I know like there's this like get your rough draft out and then like once you have that, you can revisit it and like make it better after. But I just find myself tinkering like with the language and with sentences as I'm going, and that doesn't work as well for novels. I have to. I've been making myself like resist the urge to like go back, and I don't know. I'm still learning about the process. It's been kind of challenging. Like I don't typically outline short stories, and I tried to like outline a novel, and I don't know if I'm just kind of trying to do that because that's what I've heard like you should do, like everyone like creates outlines for novels. So I should do that. But I think like it's something that I'm still learning.
You mentioned that editing along the way in a novel doesn't really work in the same way that it works for you in a short story. So why do you think that is?
I wonder if some of it is the time pressure. I do have to, I'm mindful of the fact that I'm trying to get a draft completed so that I can get it to my thesis director to be able to read it and then provide feedback. So I wonder, like outside of this MFA setting, like if I have more time, like maybe I would go back to using that kind of revise as I go process. But some of it is also just that it's a much longer story and you don't necessarily know where things are going. So then if you like go back and start revising and working on the smaller pieces of it, maybe it just kind of gets you stuck. I'm not entirely sure though.
Yeah, your take on the deadlines is interesting because this is one of my small gripes, I guess, about the MFA program is that I'm constantly thinking about deadlines. And so I'll be working on a story and I know I have to have it done by this date for workshop. And also I need my greater collection done by this date for my thesis defense. And so there are times when I feel like I would have stepped away from a story and worked on something else that I feel like I have to keep going on the thing that I'm working on because I have this deadline I have to meet. So yeah, I don't know. How do you think your process will change once you're out of this environment?
I mean, I agree that it can be really like challenging to work with time pressure, but I wonder if I'll try to like hold on to some of that because there's something to be said for having externally imposed deadlines that maybe keep you, at least for me, I wonder if that'll keep me on track in some ways. I worry that I am kind of prone to like having, I don't know, like a lot of indecisiveness or like fear of missing out or something. Like, so I'll start a story and maybe get to the, I think that's happening with this novel where I just have a lot of different ideas. And I think that there's a risk of just spending a lot of time, like starting, at least for me, like starting a lot of different pieces. And if without that kind of external pressure to finish something, maybe I never would finish anything. So I think that's something I'll have to experiment with, like see, do I set a goal of like try to finish, 5 short stories in a year? Do I set a goal of, I don't know. I'll have to figure it out.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. The whole deadline thing can be a really good thing in some instances, right? It keeps you motivated. It keeps you moving. It keeps you working on a story when maybe you would just stop writing altogether, right? Yeah. That's the other thing you have to think about. Like if the deadlines are gone, then what's going to keep me from just not writing at all? So there are pluses and minuses for sure. But I have also been wondering, like, okay, what's my writing life going to look like without the deadlines? I think I'll still be motivated to write every day, but are stories going to be less linear in like how I produce them, right? Is it because right now it's like I have to finish that first draft, I have to revise it, I have to edit it, I have to put it into the workshop. Am I going to feel like I have more leeway to like start something, put it aside, come back to it a month from now? It'll be interesting to see. So I mentioned that Indiana is a fully funded program. According to their website, each student is funded through a teaching assistantship, and sometimes students receive additional funding through fellowships. So besides taking workshop classes, you also get to teach them at Indiana. What's that experience been like for you?
It's been good. So the teaching requirements. So I will say that because I'm the editor-in-chief for Indiana Review, I have a slightly different teaching experience with Indiana. So you teach typically in the first year, you'll teach like introductory creative writing. We call that 103. And there you work with like a faculty member is like the instructor of record, I guess. And then the MFA students, the first year MFA students will teach will lead a discussion section. So you do have like that guidance to some extent. Although again, like how much guidance you have and like how much freedom you have, I guess is maybe the better way to put it, is dependent on like how the professor wants to run the course. Plus, you also, in the first semester, take like creative writing pedagogy. So that's another way where you have some support to learn about like how to teach things and troubleshoot. Yeah, it was a really good resource. And then in your second year, you typically teach composition. There might be some opportunities to teach. There's like a literary publishing and editing course. And again, you take a pedagogy for composition, like specific to that. And that provides a similar kind of thing where you learn about teaching composition and do some troubleshooting. And then in your third year, I won't be teaching, but typically like people will teach 203, which is like another like creative writing thing. And that's a smaller class where the instructor, the MFA student, have a lot of freedom. Like you're creating the syllabus and deciding like what direction you want to take it and all of that. So it's really cool. I think I'm actually I'm sad to be missing out on that in some ways. As much as I am really enjoying Indiana Review, that's something that I'll be sad to not have had the opportunity to do.
Well, before we get to IR, because I do want to talk about Indiana Review, it's clear on the website that each student is fully funded at Indiana, but it's harder to figure out how much you all are actually paid. So what does the funding package look like?
The base funding for teaching, you get like $19,000. So that's like for everyone. But on top of that, like there are a number of like different fellowships, and eligibility for it often depends on like your background. Like there are some diversity things and, all sorts of things like that. So that's the 19 is the base. Like I have more than that through various things. And my understanding is that most of us have more than that.
So those like fellowships and awards, are those things that you have to apply directly for, or are you just automatically considered for those things?
It depends on which one it is. So when I got my my offer to come here, it came with I knew what fellowships I would have. But there are also things that you can apply for through the university that might be like later on. Like there are some different eligibility things, and like you have to be in a particular year and all of that. So I think that typically for like some of the things from the department, you would know beforehand.
Speaking of applying to things, how does the Indiana Review work? Did you have to apply for that position? Were you thinking about that in your first year? It's a 2-year position. I'm guessing your second and third year. So in your first year in the program, is that something you were already thinking about and then you had to apply for? How does that all work?
Yeah. The Indiana Review is an entirely graduate student run organization. And I mean, with some support from the department, on some administrative things. But I was thinking about applying for Indiana Review and just being involved in some way when I came as a visiting student. And I actually attended a meeting. Like they invited the people who were admitted to the program to come sit in on a meeting just to see what it was like and to kind of get a sense of like what that aspect of MFA life was like. So after that, like I was sold on, wanting to be involved in it. Just the way they were talking about it and just how warm the environment was. I knew pretty much that like this is something that I want to be involved in. And I also had some experience like in law school working on an academic journal, but it was kind of similar. So it was something that I was just already thinking about. So in my first year, I was a reader. So I read for fiction and did a little bit of like reading for other things just because I was curious, like what the nonfiction and poetry reading would be like. And then in like spring of the first year, that's when we typically will announce that we're looking for editors for the next year. So I had to apply then. And then I knew going into the summer between first and second year that I would be associate editor the next year and then go on to be editor-in-chief.
So how's that experience been being editor-in-chief of Indiana Review?
It's been great. Like I just took over as editor-in-chief, like I guess like earlier this summer. So it's still like something I'm new to in a way, even though like I've kind of, gone through a year of some of this stuff as associate editor, but I've really enjoyed it. There are a lot of different things that I have to do like in this position. We are, it's a small staff. Like it's, a handful of like senior editors and readers. And then we work with some interns. But it's just, a few of us and it's exciting. It's also difficult. So there are a lot of different things I have to do, right? So I have to, I read submissions. I have to, that makes it sound like I just like it. Like I get to read submissions, and be part of like that kind of decision-making process in selecting like the pieces that we will ultimately publish. And then we also work with authors to edit some of those pieces. And, sometimes it's like something really tiny, like consider deleting this comma in this poem, in this line. And sometimes it's a little bit more expensive, but I really, really enjoy editing and working like closely with language, at that kind of, granular level. So that's something that I find really fulfilling. So there's like the submission and like the editorial process. But then there are also like things like applying for grants and like trying to fund our journal and trying to fund like different things that we're doing. Like we do an annual reading and we need to like figure out a way to be able to pay the people who come to read. And there's also like the social media side of things, which is like, that's been challenging for me, like as someone who doesn't have a social media. Like I don't use Twitter or anything, but I do now because I had to learn to, help promote the journal and engage with, like other journals and just our readers.
So how has this insider view of the publishing world, how has it affected your own writing and your own submitting practices?
So in terms of writing, I think reading a lot in general is something that, is really beneficial, I think, to me, and I'm sure to other writers too. I don't want to overstate, but I think I can pretty confidently say that. So like in that way, like it's perhaps been like directly affecting my writing and like how I think about it. Just because like having the experience of reading so many submissions and just thinking about them and then talking critically about, like different pieces and trying to figure out like what works in this, like what works and what excites me about this. And it forces me to have that like kind of conversation with myself. And that ends up coming through in my work, maybe like that kind of critical engagement or that lens. maybe it makes it a little easier to kind of apply that to my own work. And then in terms of submitting and all of that, I don't know that it's necessarily like affected me in a way that I can really point to like specifically, but I think that I'm engaging like through Indiana Review with more like other journals, and just I'm trying to keep on top of like what other people are doing, what other magazines are doing, and like publishing and things like that. So I think it's just helped me to kind of see like what is going on and like what sorts of things or what journals are out there, and maybe made me, I don't know, like understand like what's going on when I am waiting to hear back from a magazine. Like, why is it taking, 6 months to hear back? Like what's going on that side of the table?
So when you have a submission out and it's been 6 months and Submittable says that it's in progress, right? Mm-hmm. What are you thinking? How has your mindset changed in that situation as opposed to before you had this experience?
I think I'm probably thinking like they have a lot of other submissions and a lot of other work that they are doing too. Just keeping a magazine running it just takes a lot, and it's not just the submissions, and like there's more to it that's going on behind the scenes. So I think it's just made me more patient in a way, which is not to say that I don't like go back to Submittable and like check like, has anything changed to in progress today?
Well, we have to talk about rejection, okay? Because it's unfortunately a huge part of the writing life. And it can be really demoralizing to write a story that you think is good, that your peers think is good, your professors say is good, and then you send it out and it doesn't seem to get any traction when you're sending it to journals, right? So how do you deal with rejection? And as the editor-in-chief of a really good literary magazine, what information or advice could you share with listeners who are dealing with rejection?
That's a really good question. And actually this is perhaps what I should have talked a little bit about in my previous answer. And that is that it's really subjective, right? Like with a small staff, like with very few people who are making some of these decisions, and even with a larger staff, like for magazines that have more people, it's not necessarily like it's not saying anything about your work. Like you can't draw conclusions from a rejection, I think is maybe the piece of advice that I would give people. Like maybe you can draw a conclusion from an acceptance. I don't know. That's a different question. But, it's part of the process. Like there are so few pages within a magazine that they have allotted to new pieces. And depending on like how many different things they're getting, like there just isn't space to publish all the work that you get that you want to publish. And I think that it maybe this like being involved in Indiana Review has made rejection a little bit easier to deal with. Not entirely. I mean, I woke up to a rejection this morning and like kind of was feeling a little sad, but not really. I mean, I'm feeling a little bit like, that was my morning. Yeah. Not really. That's making it sound like it ruined my day or something, but it didn't. Like I got a rejection and then I sent out the story to like 3 other places. And I think it's just part of the process. And it's okay to feel bad about, a rejection when it happens, but I think it's good not to like wallow in it and to kind of move on, because it's part of the process. And the more like pieces you send out, right? Like, don't they say it's a numbers game? And maybe it is.
Okay, so you just said you got a rejection this morning, and then you turned around and you sent it out to 3 other journals. Is that like a typical process for you, like in submitting? What does your submissions process look like? How do you know when to send something or like where to send it?
I was kind of exaggerating with that. I did send it to somewhere. I sent a different story out to somewhere else. Actually, it wasn't even that story. But yeah, there are just so many journals out there, and it can be hard to keep up with them. So something that I do to kind of get a sense of like where I might want to apply is either on like the copyright page or on the back, like in the acknowledgments of like short story collections, where people have like written like where they publish some of the pieces in that collection. Like that's been a really good way to kind of get a sense of like what the specific like aesthetic or general aesthetic of various magazines might be. And so that's been like one way of like finding places to send work out to. And then just spending a lot of time on the internet and just like poking around, like just seeing like, oh, here's a new journal I hadn't heard about before. Like, I wonder what kind of work they're putting out there. And what's really great is that a lot of places have like even print magazines will sometimes have like little snippets of like the work they're publishing, or will have some sort of like online feature. So that's been a good way of like kind of getting a sense of like what kind of work the lit mags are publishing. So I guess maybe another way of saying that is that part of my process for submitting is getting a sense of what kind of work they're looking for, and then like trying to figure out like, does this fit my aesthetic? And then I also have, I don't think I'm alone in this, like have an Excel spreadsheet with like where I keep track of everything. And like when I get rejected, I like gray things out so I don't have to see it. And then like it's mostly gray. And then like there's like one little bit of, a little bit of color on there. And yeah.
Well, speaking of submitting, the Indiana Review is currently accepting submissions for a contest, right?
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about that.
Sure. So our half K prize, which is a little bit unclear from the title, but it's basically we're accepting submissions in any genre for pieces that are up to half K, like 500 words each. And something that we're able to do this time, which we're really excited about, is offer free submissions for Black or Indigenous writers. And we can offer free submissions for Black or Indigenous writers until we run out of funds for it. So we're trying to find more funds to help cover submission fees. But, right now we have a certain amount, and hopefully we'll have more opportunities for free submissions in the future as well.
So any genre, as long as it's under 500 words, you can submit it. And is it like you just submit one piece, or you submit up to 3?
Right. You can submit up to 3 of 500 words each. So it could be like a short. It could be a micro essay. I don't even know what all the different words are. It could be poems. It could be kind of cross genre. Yeah, anything. All
right. So you ready? I'm going to put you on the spot.
Sure.
You talked about looking at other journals and trying to figure out their aesthetic to see where you should send it. Could you possibly sum up the aesthetic that Indiana Review is looking for in submissions?
Sure. So what we like to say is that we're really excited about work that is carefully strange, whatever that means. So, I think the best way to really get a sense of things is to read content. But yeah, it could be strange in terms of form. It could be strange in terms of language. I don't know.
Well, I love that you all are trying to find opportunities to provide free submissions to underrepresented communities. And speaking of providing those opportunities in the literary world, I want to give you a chance to tell listeners about MFA App Review. We've mentioned it on the show a couple of times, but you've been both an applicant and a reader for them. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us about the organization, what they do, and what listeners can expect were they to submit to them?
Sure. So I will say that I think the best way to get information about them would be to go to their website. I'm not, on their administration or anything like that. I've only been involved in this smaller capacity. But yeah, their whole thing is that they're trying to increase access to fully funded MFA programs. And, they're looking to help BIPOC writers, people who are just, there are lots of different groups, and you should definitely check out their website, which has more details on that. And when I was an applicant, I was paired with a reader who, looked at my writing sample and my statement of purpose for applications, and just talked to me about, what was working, and all of that. And it was just great to have someone to be able to talk to, especially, as someone who didn't have people to share my work with. So that was just a little bit of a confidence boost. But it was also I ended up replacing one of the stories that I had initially planned to use. And so I think it was a really helpful process. And then as a reader, I've just been, I've done it for the past 2 years, and I'd hope to do it again. And that's been really great. Just working with, doing the same thing and giving back, to people and doing what I can to help out. So yeah, I definitely think that they're doing some great work and worth checking out.
Yeah, that's great. They are really a wonderful organization. And, you talked about getting involved as a reader. Are there other ways that people can support MFA App Review?
Yes, I believe that you can donate to them, and I think they have a fund for application fees for Black writers. You'd need to look into the specifics, but you can donate to them as well.
Okay, well, before we go, I want to give you the last word, and my final question for you is, what do you think is one thing that Indiana University is doing really well in their MFA program, and what's one thing you think they could improve on?
Great question. So I'll start with the what they could improve on. And I think something that I would love to see them do is hire another fiction faculty member. We have 2 full-time fiction faculty members right now, and they're great. And I've really loved working with them. And I've never felt like, I'm not getting attention and all of that, or that my work isn't getting respected. But I think it's just nice to be able to have the opportunity to work with different people who have different perspectives, on writing or whatever. And so I'd love to see another fiction faculty member. But in terms of what they're doing well, like it's just been such a wonderful time for me. Like that it's a warm, welcoming, non-competitive space where I feel supported and I feel like I can try whatever weird things in my writing that I want to do, like within reason. But, I've been just finding it to be such a productive and good time.
Well, that's great. I'm glad that you've found a place where you can workshop your creative writing. You don't have to work on your writing underground anymore. You can share it with people in the workshop, and I'm glad you feel supported. And I'm really glad that you took the time to talk to me. This has been really great.
Yeah, thank you again for inviting me. This has been great.